We got some big one championship news out of a press conference yesterday at the time of recording this video about some striking stuff. You know, Tao and Chai might be injured and out of 1169. We found out that Takiru and Rodtang have already agreed a date for their fight, providing that both men, are healthy and ready to make that date. But the biggest news regarding One Championship actually ended up coming out later that day, as former two-weight world champion in one, Reinier de Ridder, has signed to the UFC in a shock move, it's fair to say, but also it's been an interesting time for RDR as of late, as we will get into. I'm sure, you guys might have seen the video that I put up on this channel at that time, so you'll know, I spoke about it then in detail, so we won't go over everything from that video, but we'll talk about it a little bit. Let me pull up the article here of the news being confirmed by MMA Fighting. So there you go. UFC signs former two Division One champion Reinier de Ridder. RDR is inked a deal with the UFC. Multiple people with knowledge of the situation confirmed the news to MMA Fighting. The signing became public Tuesday following a tweet from the Roster Tracker account. That's a Twitter page that just announces when people have been signed. I believe it says when people have been cut as well. Worth a follow just for things like this. And then a little bit about RDR and MMA Fighting David Martin contributed to the story. So there you go. So there you have it. RDR has signed to the UFC. Now let's get into how this has happened, because I saw a few people online being like, why would they sign him at this point in his career, right? RDR is currently, was he 34? Let me just double check that. I think that's right. Yeah, 34. The fact of the matter is, I think the UFC would have signed him earlier if that was an option. It's not like they were like, no, we think we're going to wait and see how this pans out. It just wasn't an option up until this point. And RDR has kind of made this happen for himself. If you guys remember, again, referencing the previous video I already made on this channel, he signed a fight on UAE Warriors. Just checking it was UAE Warriors, right? Yeah, UAE Warriors 51. That took place at the end of July. That was the same night as UFC 304 in Manchester, where he stopped Magomed Murad Kasayev. Magomed Murad Kasayev, there you go, in the first round, and looked impressive, as RDR often does. And it was a confusing period, because when that fight got announced, the immediate reaction to that news was that RDR was still signed to One Championship. And so would there be a breach of contract? Was there a miscommunication in terms of the fact that he was actually able to go and get this fight and people didn't know at the time? I don't know. I'm sure we will find out more on that in the coming months, especially once he starts to do the kind of UFC media rounds. There might also be part of it where he's not allowed to talk about it. He might not want to talk about it as well, which is completely fair enough. Obviously, he doesn't want to step on too many toes and stuff, but it is interesting, right? Because when that UAE Warriors fight got announced, I was like, I don't think that's going to go ahead. And then it did. Like, even the photos of just seeing him out there on Fight Week was like, whoa, this is actually going to happen right now. RDR is kind of forcing his way out. And I know that he's wanted to fight more consistently for quite some time now. If you look at his record, in fact, I'll pull it on screen for you now. Let me just switch the screen over to his Tapology account here. And I will get myself... am I blocking too much there? Yeah, we'll flip over to the other side. There you go. So if you look at, his recent fights, the Tai Ruotolo at One Fight Night 10, as you can see, is a grappling match. So in terms of MMA, he fought in July of 2022, December of 2022, and then was out until March earlier this year, where he lost to Anatoly Malakin for a second time. And then, like I said, came back at UAE Warriors later that year. Well, I say later that year, later this year, I should say. So he's been wanting to fight more often, and I think the fact of the matter has been that these divisions that RDR fights in one are not that populated. Those being middleweight is his more natural home, but also he's gone up to light heavyweight. Now, it is important to remember that one's weight classes are higher because of the hydration testing. So when he fights at middleweight in one, he's actually fighting at what light heavyweight would be in the UFC, 205 pounds. So he is going to be fighting at middleweight, apparently, in the UFC, which I think he should be able to make, because there aren't the hydration tests. So he'll be able to cut a bit more in order to make that. And I think he would be undersized at light heavyweight, to be honest. it's difficult because I haven't seen him fight a lot of guys that have also fought in the UFC. So I would need to kind of see that. I'm excited to see that as well. I should state that straight off the bat. I am, as much as I have enjoyed watching RDR in one championship, I'm a big RDR fan. I want to see him fight as often as he wants to. And I'm interested to see how he does in the UFC. We'll get to that in a minute in terms of where he slots in this middleweight division. But he's wanted to fight more often. And I don't think that option was really there for him in one championship, like I said, in terms of the depth of these weight classes, but also the fact that he's been beaten by Anatoly Malakin twice. Malakin fought him for the first time in 2022 and beat him for the light heavyweight title and in just a dominant performance. And then Malakin moved down to middleweight earlier this year to become a 3-weight world champion, beat RDR for his middleweight belt as well. That fight was a bit more competitive, but it did kind of always feel like it was a snowball going downhill. Malakin was just kind of going through the motions and picking up as RDR was kind of slowing down. He was gassed by the time the third round, kind of came around. I will say that in that fight, actually, we'll dive into how I think, what can people expect from him in the UFC? The first thing to note is that during that long period of time off where he was kind of working his way back for the Malakin rematch, striking was obviously a huge part of his training at that time because Malakin's striking is pretty scary. And he had just, RDR wasn't able to take him down in that first fight. So he had to stand with Malakin and he just couldn't compete on the feet with Malakin. So that was a big part of the training camp, I think, for the second fight was making sure that if he does have to stay standing, he can not only keep himself safe, but also offer some offense back at him. And he did do that. He was able to be a little bit safer. He had a lot higher guard. In the end, Malakin is a very smart striker. I think, obviously a force of nature right now in one championship. Started going to the body, and that just eventually broke RDR down throughout the rounds until it was stopped. But he was a little bit safer defensively, and his jab in particular, and he offered some kicks, some knees when Malakin got close. So there was definitely some improvements there. So I'll be interested to see how his striking looks now that he's going into the UFC. But of course, I'm sure a lot of you will already be familiar with RDR. Again, as we'll get to in a minute, because there's been a lot of talk comparing him to the UFC fighters in his weight class for a long time now. His submission game is really where RDR thrives, the Dutch Knight. He's got 12 pro wins by submission, I believe it is. Yeah, 12 wins by submission, never been submitted. Has a record of 17-2, those 2 losses coming to Anatoly Malakin. So his last 2 MMA fights are his only 2 losses. Defeated Ongla and Sang twice to become the middleweight and then light heavyweight champion in one. But yeah, his submission skills are his trait. As I spoke to RDR actually earlier this year before the comeback against Malakin for a piece for fighters only, that if you want to check it out, you can get the app and get the subscription, and you can go find this piece that I spoke to RDR for, and we went into everything from how he got started in martial arts to his training camp for the Malakin rematch, loads of stuff. And his jiu-jitsu is his foundation, which maybe you wouldn't expect considering that he is a Dutch fighter, and he spends pretty much, apart from his gym where obviously he has a lot of jiu-jitsu guys in there, and he's obviously got in high level training partners throughout the years like wrestlers and things like that, but he's surrounded by Dutch kickboxers, so he certainly isn't short on training partners for his striking. But that is the interesting thing, right, is how his jiu-jitsu and stuff is going to fare in this division. I think the wrestling is quite a big concern in terms of entering the UFC. There's obviously going to be, a fair few. Everybody in the UFC is obviously capable of fighting in all areas, but that's going to be the big thing, I think, is I wouldn't say to the same degree of a Paul Craig, for example, where his submission threat is his main game, and he kind of struggles with getting opponents to the floor because his wrestling doesn't match up with a lot of guys. I'm not saying that, this is a slight on Paul Craig. I absolutely love Paul Craig. He is so entertaining. I'm such a big fan of Paul Craig. But just to compare the styles again, not a complete perfect style comparison, but I mean that Paul Craig has kind of struggled with getting opponents to the floor and what he does when he can't get the opponents to the floor, because his striking is probably the least developed aspect of his game. RDR, I would say, it's going to be interesting to see how his wrestling crosses over, whether he's able to get fights to the floor, because if he is, his submission threat is phenomenal. And as you will see if you've seen any of his highlights, he has a variety of submission attacks as well, super creative on the ground. So it's going to be exciting, I think, for sure. Because of that submission threat and that grappling, there was a period where when he was one middleweight champion, undefeated at 16-0, I imagine it was at the time. Yeah, I think it was about 16-0, 17-0, obviously, before the Malakin defeats, where Israel Adesanya was the middleweight champion in the UFC. And it was kind of like, well, RDR is the middleweight champion in one, and he kind of has the perfect counter style to Israel Adesanya. Now, I don't think, at the time that was just kind of a thing that was talked about. In reality, if you look at it a bit closer, I would probably say that a wrestler is more the kind of counter style to Israel Adesanya's kickboxing rather than a jiu-jitsu guy, because Israel's takedown defense isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination. And so RDR closing the gap and actually getting Izzy to the floor would have been his hurdle in that fight rather than, the submission game per se. If you look at other fights with like Izzy's fights against Marvin Vettori and Dricus du Plessis recently, like it's not necessarily the issue with beating Izzy, if you're a guy that wants to use grappling, is closing that distance and getting him to the floor. And that would have been RDR's problem as well. I'm sure he would have done brilliantly against Izzy once the fight had hit the floor. But like I said, the wrestling is kind of the biggest point there. When I spoke to RDR earlier this year in that piece for Fighters Only, again, you can read about this if you would like to on the Fighters Only app or on the website. He spoke a little bit about being compared to Izzy and the kind of talk of like, basically being labeled as the best middleweight that isn't in the UFC, right? And whether that was frustrating for him at the time or something that gave him motivation. This is a quote from the piece where he spoke about that and kind of the middleweights in the UFC with Izzy and Alex Pereira and how people would often compare them to him and their different skill sets. And he said, talking about a guy like Adesanya, who at the time, like a couple years ago, I always thought like that's an easy opponent for me. It would be easy to choke a guy out like that. But I've really gotten a lot of respect for him for what he's done in these last couple of fights. Again, this was at the start of the year, so before Izzy had come back and fought Dricus. This was after the Strickland defeat. Where was I? Him coming back after that loss to Pereira, after all of those losses to Pereira, and then coming back and knocking him out. To be honest, he's a big inspiration to me at the moment. And obviously that's in reference to the fact that RDR was kind of dominated in that first fight against Malakin. And so, he, as his first loss in MMA, he really had to rebuild and rethink and come back as a new and improved fighter. And I think that we did see that to some degree in the rematch with Malakin. It's just Malakin, was able to systematically break him down rather than demolish him like he did in the first fight. So very interesting. RDR has also put up a video on social media to like actually announce that he's going to be in the UFC. It's just a funny little skit of him submitting who I assume is his brother, because they look so similar, but I'm not too sure on that. But yeah, RDR is going to be in the UFC. In terms of where he slots in, I'll be interested to see. We've seen the UFC sign some big name talents from elsewhere in the last year or so, which it's been a while since they did that, which is a lot of fun. And a lot of the time they come in and they come in quite highly. Obviously, I kind of joked when this was announced that I'm surprised he hasn't had to go through the Contender Series, but it'll be interesting. That made me lose focus. Apparently the camera didn't like that one. It'd be interesting to see where they slot him in. I don't think he needs to come in top 15 straight off the bat. I'd be interested to see, I'm not saying put him in there against a guy that is also debuting in the UFC, but I don't think there's any need to rush him straight into the top 15, even if he is 34, and you can maybe make the argument that he should have been in the UFC earlier. I mean, when you look at the top 15 at light heavyweight, if you look outside the top 10, where you've got Azamat Mirzakhanov, Anthony Smith, Dominic Reyes, Bogdan Guskov, and Alonzo Menefield, I think that's not a bad place for him to start, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a little bit outside the top 15. Maybe looking at those guys that are looking to break into the top 15 themselves so that RDR can come in, get a win, and then maybe get ranked, or then maybe get a ranked opponent. I think that would probably be best, but, we'll wait and see what happens. What do you guys want to see him, do in the UFC? Who would you like to see him debut against? How do you think RDR will do in the UFC? It's been a while since we saw him consistently active. So I think there's some questions that we're going to find out with this UFC run. I, for one, am excited. I'm happy for RDR that he's getting this opportunity. As I said, I was a big fan of him in one championship, but I just want to see him fight, and that is what he's going to be able to do inside the octagon. Thank you for checking out this video. As always, I will see you all soon, but until then, peace.